Hey, everybody. Great to be with you. Thank you for joining us. I love the trail mix, whoever got that. You know, M&Ms are a very good bait to get me here. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
I had a lot of that bait, too, man.
Yeah, good, good. A big day yesterday, right? So how did your crowd do in Pennsylvania?
I'm a Republican.
Yeah.
Democrats did pretty well in the collar counties of Philadelphia. So things are, the political winds out there are shifting a little bit, obviously.
So I just did a big, one of my deep survey dives via Google, of course, into you. And I saw you had co-sponsored legislation with Democrats on sexual harassment. You're part of a group of 10 that said there really is such a thing as climate change and we ought to prepare for it. You know, you're out there on a number of issues. I saw Mark Warner, either you applauding Mark Warner or Mark Warner applauding you on trying to end food deserts. And so you've got all this legislation that you're doing with Democrats, which is not something we hear a lot about. So before we dive into the Internet of Things, I'd love to know how you sort of look at the statutory world of that. Sure. How, are you doing something that is the precursor of a lot more bipartisanship coming, or are you the last person doing it?
I don't think I'm the last person doing it. I think that there are a lot of members of Congress and senators who should get more credit than they do get to work with others. My orientation is always towards governing and trying to solve problems. And my feeling is that if you don't solve a problem with consensus oriented information, the problem's just going to become bigger, and it's going to be even more difficult to manage down the line. My frustration is when we don't get things done on a timely basis. But I also think that you have to orient your decision making toward where the facts lead you, and that ideology has a role maybe through which to organize information and evaluate things, but ultimately there has to be practicality to how you go about getting to the finish line. And I think that Congress, look, I'm in a very swingy district with a lot of diversity of opinion, and there are parts of this country that are very, very conservative. There are parts of this country that are very, very liberal, and you have to accept that for what it is and still kind of work within the guardrails to get things done, and I try and do that. And there are other members that do that. I think that we probably have to spend more time speaking about that, because I think most Americans shake their heads and say, oh, that's like, give me more of that. Right, right.
Well, today we're talking, this is one of the topics I really like, because you're able to sort of project yourself forward and begin saying, when you're talking about a cashless world or an internet of everything or an internet of things, a world in which cities are retrofitted. People, I'm wearing my Fitbit loyally today. I am at 5146. How about you? And when we're all basically connected in a very different way that weren't there. And sometimes I imagine if we were in California or on Mars and we were not in Washington, D.C., what would be some of the questions we'd be asking? But I want to ask you, as we think about these internet of everything, this connectivity that's coming in the future, what do you worry about? If any, we were talking about your 4-month-old. Yeah. If your 4-month-old is 15 years old, you go out, 14 years and 8 months. What are the things that you hope we will have achieved in this dynamic world of innovation?
So, well, what do I worry about? It would be more Thoreau or Rousseau, in the sense that I worry that maybe we'll lose sort of what makes us human beings and nature, and like not being too dialed in. Andrew Sullivan just wrote a piece recently about, like, when you're on your phone 8 or 9 hours a day, you're not interacting with your spouse or your children, or you're just like, life is life. And sometimes you can learn a lot when you're bored. But when you're always dialed in, you're always trying to get that fix. Right. And I don't think that that's good for the human experience, because kind of how you can form bonds with people and have a common experience in this world is by getting offline. At the same point in time,
I just want to say the Atlantic fully endorses any references to Thoreau. Yeah, go ahead.
At the same point in time, there is a tremendous opportunity to create more efficiencies so that we all can live more, right? Like if it's projected that IoT is going to reduce the amount of chores, the number of hours you spend doing chores in your home by 100 hours a year, that's a good thing, right?
Right.
And the same can be said just for battery storage, energy usage, congestion mitigation. I mean, there are a lot of ways to get a lot more out of life by utilizing IoT platforms as a consumer, leisurely, as well as business-to-business applications. So I think it's obviously a balance, and I think it's important that you don't veer too far in one direction because you could lose sight of the other side of the coin.
Do you worry about the regulatory, the statutory side of this? Do you think that given what we've seen with Equifax, given what we've learned that you can hack into a car today, or I mean, even in some pretty interesting criminal cases that are coming forward, no matter where you're at, we'll be able to kind of solve some criminal cases today by tracking where the Fitbit was in a house. But it's raising these interesting questions about privacy
Sure.
and about whether we're ready for that. Do you think about that from a regulatory perspective?
I do. And on the privacy side, I think we're never going to get it right simply through a statute. I do believe that this is going to be a scenario where, look, the innovation side of this is going to be in front of anything we can do in terms of codifying privacy regulations. I think some of it is going to be cultural. What do we accept as a society more than anything else? At the same point in time, when you're talking about the security side of privacy and the Equifax breach, really that should have never happened. Equifax received the software in order to get rid of the malware, and then they didn't do it. So that should have been avoided. At the same point in time, my bigger concern, I'm less concerned about an entirely new technology creating a platform, and now you're doing something that you could never do before
right.
using IoT applications. But when you're talking about legacy systems, and then you're tacking on top of that
right.
or stacking on top of that, that's to me where some more privacy implications come about, and where perhaps I hate to say statutory, it's probably more regulatory, because I don't think Congress is ever going to really get it right. You're much better dealing with the FDA
right.
Or DOE on something IoT, look at all these acronyms coming out of my mouth, on something IoT related than Congress passing a piece of legislation that will somehow magically, comprehensively address all the sophistication of what and complexity of what may happen in a technology platform. As you
and your, because you remember the Internet of Things Caucus with
yes.
Darrell Issa and others. So I guess I sense, and we have Anna Eshoo coming up here, that there is a growing tension between those who worry about public interest being sacrificed in the name of technological advancement, and that there are lines being divided. And I wouldn't even say they're Democrat versus Republican, but there are some that worry that you can get in the way too early
Sure.
of advancement versus others. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that you're onto something, and yes, and it's a balance that I think everybody identifies with. I would say that I think a lighter touch regulation is what's needed, and here's why. Engineers have a much deeper appreciation, not for what only exists now, but for how things are going to be 5 and 10 and 20 years from now. And to have policymakers kind of predict that is going to end up probably being more of a barrier or an impediment, because technologies can solve problems quicker than we can regulate our way to solving a problem. So my sense is to have innovation lead the way. And I would say that on IoT, I would say that on clean energy, even if you look in the healthcare space, I mean, look, what you can do with a gadget that then can get connected to your physician, that then can get connected to an insurance, like if we think that government is going to be able to regulate that space in such a manner that we're going to make it more efficient than technology would be able to make it, I think that that's a fool's errand.
If not you, who's the smartest technologist in Congress?
Darrell Issa, I would think.
Really?
Amongst Republicans, I think Will Hurd has an exceptional background. I'm sure that there are some Democratic members as well that I don't know as well. I would say my colleague, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, who's up next, who I don't know too well, but I serve on the committee with her. She has served on these subcommittees of jurisdiction for quite some time, and she gets it, I mean, thoroughly. I'm still, I mean, I'm a new puppy.
But when you're in there, and because I asked this in a way because I'm wondering who the standouts are, but then there are quite many hundreds of you out there. To what degree you would grade and say, between A and F, the average literacy of members of Congress on these Internet of Things issues, as we begin looking at a cashless society, begin looking at ledgers, digital ledgers, when we begin looking at I was at Intel the other day, and they've got a rug that you can walk across that can predict whether you're going to have a stroke. It's going to be a very different world that we're walking into.
I think younger members are probably a little bit more predisposed to technology, but I would also say that technology for many people, if you're a banker, you get technology in the financial services space. If you're a physician, you get it in the medical space. Very few people can see it broadly and appreciate how it can. If you're a governor or a mayor, you get so much of what you can do in terms of municipal services and how you can create efficiencies there. The same if you're in law enforcement. So I think everybody knows that technology can create a more efficient society. It can solve problems. Everybody knows sort of the privacy versus sort of open, the open platform versus keeping things private, and the cybersecurity issues, and they all manifest themselves kind of the same way in any number of different sectors of our economy and in our lives. But if you're not in the tech space every single day, it's very difficult, and I don't pretend to be an expert, to see how technology can sort of penetrate our society in a more encompassing way.
Before I go to the audience, I want to just ask you kind of an ecosystem question, because in part what we're talking about in technological advancement is it's partly science, partly innovation. You've got to have innovators out there. A lot of this is in partnership with academia. You've got to get the regulatory structure right. And we were just talking about the time when I worked in the Senate in the 1990s, and even then, Senator Jeff Bingaman, who was a real believer in technology, thought that our investments in things like NIH or the National Science Academies and others was diminishing. What would you say when we talk about this? Is this all going to happen anyway, or do you sort of see the United States making a mistake by not investing at the levels we once were in this wonderful ecosystem?
On the government side?
Yeah, I mean, the government has a role. I'd love to hear what you think that role ought to be.
So another member, Ro Khanna, who's a new freshman member from California, who's a Democrat, also gets this stuff extremely well. I think that if our country does not look at how our technology and our innovation is ultimately going to be embedded in the global economy, because all this stuff is we're not creating technology that's just used in our country anymore. And as a consequence of that, I think that whether it's NIST or I think it's ISO, which is sort of the international society, those sort of cybersecurity and best practices types of international bodies where we've historically shown leadership and been pioneering, if we take a step back from that, I fear that the rest of I think investment will necessarily start going elsewhere, and we won't be viewed the way that we are now.
And then you worry about that?
I do. I think we should all worry about that. I mean, we are the most. We are still the world's economic superpower, and globalism diminishes that a little bit, but we still are. But you see that when you start outsourcing leadership or allowing other countries to step in because you don't want to for whatever reason.
That's great. Did you ever see the Jimmy Stewart movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington?
You got a little
Mr. Smith.
Probably because of my hair is all slicked back.
And it's interesting. Yes, we got questions right here in the front, I guess. Right here in the front, yes.
Hi, I'm Joanna Brignolo. I'm a longtime attendee of these events. Can you comment on Elon Musk's new venture called Neuralink, wanting to have like a Borg-like relationship to machines, putting computer chips in our brains?
He has a lot of different ideas like that. Actually, so I can't. The one that actually, and I don't mean to be diversionary, but the one that I actually started thinking about, and the more I thought about it, the more I was like, yeah, that really could be a serious issue on the AI side of war robots, right? And like, what could happen if if a foreign hostile nation had a machine here and was just able to push a couple buttons and could cause mass chaos. And I never really thought about that before, but I started thinking about that. And I think he even made a statement like, we need to get out in front of this now because it's coming and it's coming.
He worries about
quickly.
AI, and you know, Vladimir Putin actually said the nation that controls AI controls the world, and Elon in response says it started.
And I would look how sophisticated Russia was in terms of intelligence gathering for our there was an effort to create chaos and disorder and hostility amongst ourselves by a foreign actor. And I think that will continue, and I think AI and technology is a threat in that respect. And that's where I think that's where global leadership and even American leadership, just in terms of the security of our country, is reason enough why you can't sort of cede any ground.
Do you think just to follow up on this, and then I'll take another question, are the hearings on these things, I don't follow them closely enough, are they of the quality and standard that they're good enough to begin thinking about bots and AI and what may be coming down, or are we fighting the battles of the past?
I think some of it is reactive, some of it seeks to be forward-looking. Some of it is, I think, trying to determine whether we need a statutory response,
right,
or if are we comfortable that the regulatory agencies, whomever they may be, in a given on a given issue set, are receptive and are hospitable to what's happening in the innovation space.
Yeah, right here, please.
Hi, I'm Miriam Ramani with Global Cyber Alliance. The question I have is, we are expecting 50 billion Internet of Things devices by 2020. How, without making sure security is built in from the beginning in the production of these devices, do we ensure that safety, security, privacy, some of the things you touched on, are going to stay intact, and the trust in the internet is going to be maintained?
Great question.
It is. I think that, let me make a couple points here. Number one, government alone will never be able to deal with that. I mean, it ultimately it's probably more of a private sector issue than it is a government issue, because if the private sector doesn't get it right, then you won't get the value that you need to create. That's number one. Number two, the single biggest issue that government has to deal with, from my perspective on IoT, which is necessarily a government function, is spectrum management. So there's legislation out there right now, like how much data will IoT need, or how much capacity, bandwidth from a spectrum management perspective. And you see these reverse auctions, and we don't know. And I think that we really need to chart that path and do those sort of predictive analytics so that we are collapsing spectrum for our, let's just call them legacy media outlets that don't need what they have, and look at ways that we're doing emergency response and some public functions which can be on the same spectrum as others and just sort of supersede or superimpose themselves when they need, rather than having their own bands, because IoT is going to take up more space. We know that already, and that's purely a government FCC issue.
Right. Do you in this line, which I think is a great question on the kind of issue of security broadly, and kind of deal with this, Mark Warner, Senator Warner, who you've been tied up with on food deserts, he has basically tried to put legislation outside the U.S. government, which does buy a lot. It basically sets, creates markets, saying we shouldn't be buying anything that doesn't have the ability for security patches, where the vendors aren't committed to patching inevitable possible problems within the system. Would you support that kind of thing?
It's obviously sounds sensible to me. I want to look a little deeper at what is precise legislation.
I know it's always the details, but we tweet that out. Sounds sensible to me. #. Ladies and gentlemen, Ryan Costello, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you.